Hey everyone, I'm Will and welcome to another video. What are we talking about in this one? You guessed it. It's about sharpness. It's about getting an image in focus from front to back. Now, through teaching and being out there running workshops, I feel like this is one of those key things that people keep bringing up. They're not quite happy with the clarity in their images and they're not 100% certain on what f-stop they should be at. So that's what we're going to address in this video. And by the end, I'm pretty sure you're going to have a very solid grasp on how to get your images sharp and in focus all the way through. All right, let's have a look. The first thing that we're going to talk about when it comes to getting an image sharp is, are you handheld or are you using a tripod? Now, the main concern here is that if you are handheld, which is what I typically do, you need to keep in mind that you can't go too slow on your shutter speed. Now, how do we know how slow we can go? Well, there's going to be a few factors. Do you have a stabilized mirrorless camera? Do you have a stabilized lens? And do you suffer from the old shaky shake with the hands? All these factors combined, as well as your focal length as well, your heart rate, is it cold? All of that comes together to determine how slow can you go. One of the guidelines that I like to teach is, whatever your focal length is, try to match that with your shutter speed. So for example, if you zoomed in at 100 mil, make sure you're about 1/100th of a second. So 1/100th. If you zoom in the 200, be at least 200th of a second. If you're wider at 20 mil, make sure you're at least 20th of a second. Now that is a guideline, and I completely blow that guideline out of the water myself because it's not uncommon for me to be at 16 mil doing 0.4 second exposure. The guideline would say you need to be 15th, 16th of a second, but I definitely go below that. But that guideline, if you stick to that, you should be pretty safe. And if you choose to try and experiment and go slower than whatever the focal length is, just be aware that you're in that, what I call the danger zone. And you really want to make sure that now you're rested, relaxed, heart rate's not too high, nice and comfy, 3 points of stabilization. So holding the camera, 2 hands pressed against your face, maybe, resting the elbow on something, nice and steady. If you are finding that you need a really long exposure, like astrophotography, now it's just time to dust off the older tripod and just use that instead. So first and foremost, make sure the shutter speed is fast enough to be handheld. And it's very common when I'm teaching, I'll come along and check and someone is sitting at 100 mil and they're sitting there at 1/10th of a second, which is just way too slow for that focal length. So the science behind it is basically the more zoomed you are, the more magnified that vibration will appear through the lens. You can just imagine, just like if we're holding something short here, it's barely moving, but if this item, this memory card, was 40 feet long, the shake here is minimal, but down the end, it's going to be shaking around like crazy. So that's how it's kind of working with the optics. So first and foremost, make sure the shutter speed is fast enough to be handheld. All right, once you've established your shutter speed might be okay, the next thing is when it comes to settings, the f-stop, okay, the aperture. How narrow do we need that f-stop? The way the f-stop works is it's a blade inside the lens, opening and closing. It will increase or decrease light coming in and out of the camera, but also, and pretty much more importantly, it's going to adjust our depth of field. And depth of field is essentially how much of our scene do we want sharp, progressing towards us, the photographer, as well as further off into the distance. Now, there are a few key considerations. First and foremost, your focal length will also alter the depth of field. So a longer, tighter focal length, like 200 mil, will be a lot shallower at, say, f11 than what 16 mil will be at f11, all right? So the first thing is your focal length. The other big factor is proximity to first subject matter. So what I mean by that is, if I'm using this in my foreground and I am incredibly close to it like I am here, and this is my composition, framing everything up, first subject matter, my proximity to it is incredibly close. So if I have that in the foreground and something off in the distance, I have a huge depth of field, okay? Now I need to use a narrower aperture, something like f11, f16, etc. If my first subject matter is further off and I'm back here still, and my composition is maybe a bit higher, but that mug is still the first item, but my proximity to it is not that close, now I may not need f11. I might be able to get away with f8, for example. The extreme representation of that is if you're shooting something 3 miles away with a long lens, it's far off in the distance, maybe some rolling trees or mountains. To the lens now, that is just a flat surface. Even though there is obvious separation and depth between the trees or the mountain layers, whatever it is, because it is so far away, the focal plane to the lens appears flat. So all you need to really do is just say, do I have something near to me as well as something far away? If the answer is yes, you will need to start closing that f-stop down. Now, what's the magic number? There is no magic number, because it depends how close you are and what that focal length is. So what do you do in that case? Start on something like f8, take the shot, and then just zoom in and just have a look and see if it's in focus on your first item, and then in the distance, so on and so forth. If it's not, let's close the f-stop down a little bit more and adjust accordingly. So typically, if I'm shooting something far off in the distance, I don't really care what the f-stop is. I'll lower that f-stop down to maybe help brighten the exposure, especially because I'm shooting handheld. That helps a lot. Instead of being at f16, I'll go to f7. It's nice and bright, off we go. So logically, you don't really want to close your f-stop down too far because of diffraction. Diffraction is where our lens optics are just a lot softer, especially in the corners using wide angle lenses. So start on a wider aperture like f7, f8, progressively close down from there. Now, the next example is, what if you are so close to that foreground, you're sitting here, you've tried f11, you've tried f16, you're now at f22, and you just can't get it sharp on your foreground element as well as the background, vice versa. What do you do then? This is where you may need to focus stack. I've got a video on focus stacking. Focus stacking is where we've decided we can't get it in a single frame. We'll now have to focus right at the beginning of our first subject matter, take a frame, focus further off, take another one, and take multiple frames and blend it together. You might have to do that, and that will typically be when you're determined to get ultra close to your foreground. So the next thing we're going to talk about, where do we focus then? That's a big thing as well. So if you are focusing and you have something close in the foreground, if you're focusing far off in the distance, you might find that you're shallow in the foreground. If you focus on the foreground, you might find that you're out of focus in the background. If you focus in the midground, and what we sometimes call a third of the way into the frame, but honestly, it's just easy to probably just say the midground area, your depth of field extends towards you as well as further away. So if you're focusing that midground area, you can imagine your depth of field coming towards you, further away, you're getting that coverage, especially with f11 or f16. But if you're doing that and focusing right on the front, you're not going to quite get the coverage to go all the way through to the background. And same if you're focusing on the background, it's not going to quite come down to that foreground. So focus in that mid-zone area, and if you're using a narrow aperture, then you should be fine. Now, if it's all far off in the distance, you don't have that close proximity to the first subject matter, then it almost doesn't matter, to be honest. But it's really about when you have clear defined foreground, midground, background, you're quite close in the frame there. That's where you want to be a bit strategic. Just focus in that midground area, and hopefully your depth of field is going to give you the coverage that you need. Now, the last point I'm going to mention is about your optics, your lens. There is no doubt that some lenses are far better than others, and as you can probably imagine, typically what ends up being the case is the more expensive the glass, the sharper it is, and you'll find that prime lenses are even sharper again when it comes to zooms. Thankfully, zooms are so good these days, so all I use is zoom lenses, zoom wide, zoom mid-range, and then the telephoto. But if you are rocking a cheaper lens, particularly like a kit lens that might have came with your camera when you first purchased it, it's just not going to be as sharp as if you buy some high-end glass. It's just a matter of fact. So just keep that in mind, but I don't expect you to rush out and go buy good glass straight away. It's not practical. We can't all afford it, because the final thing I'm going to touch on, guys, and this is just to finish up now, don't obsess about sharpness too much. I feel like when I first began, I was just over-emphasizing it and zooming into the smallest details and questioning, am I sharp, am I not sharp? And I feel like that's why videos like this, anything to do with sharpness on YouTube, always gets a lot of hits, because when you're starting out, you're really not sure Is it sharp enough? What's in focus? What's not in focus? So hopefully this video now has just shed some light on it. If you follow those tips that I've given you, then rest assured you pretty much should be getting sharp shots. And when you check your images, don't zoom in at like 800%. Be realistic, just you only need to go in about 200%. Take an image out of focus on purpose, maybe just handheld, shake on purpose. Take one not shaking, just so you can compare, all right, what does it look like when there's a bit of vibration? What does it look like when it's actually sharp? Even with the f-stop, do some tests now around the house, different f-stops of the same frame, get the idea for what is shallow depth of field, what is infinite depth of field, and it will just help train your eye so you can be confident that you are getting sharp photos. Hope you enjoyed this quick tip video. Look forward to seeing you in another one soon. Cheers.